So, you've created a 3D model and you want to import it into your Unity project. You might think it's as simple as just dragging your .blend file into Unity, but it's a little more complicated than that. You could theoretically do that, but it's bad practice and it will take up a lot of memory in your project. Instead, what you want to do is export it from Blender to a new file type and then import that file into Unity. Before we get to exporting though, I'm just going to hit Z on my keyboard and go to Material Preview. Make sure that my textures are all applied properly and there's no tearing. And so everything looks pretty good to me. I don't see any issues that I wouldn't want imported into my file. So next I can go to File, Export, FBX. FBX is a pretty commonly accepted file format for 3D models. It's accepted by Unity and Unreal, so this is the one that I use most often. So if we go to our Materials tab and just look at the materials that I have applied to this object, we have this image texture for a label that I've created in Photoshop and then imported into Blender. And we have a metallic shader that I've created using the shader system in Blender. So I don't want to have to create a new metallic shader in Unity when I get into Unity. I'm going to have to re-import this texture because it's an image, but I also want to save these parameters that I've set for, the roughness, the metallic, the sheen and everything. So I don't want to have to redo that. So what I'm going to do is set my path mode to copy and then make sure that I've clicked embed textures. And if it's highlighted blue, then you know it's selected. This is going to save all of my texture information to the FBX file that I'm going to be exporting and then importing into Blender, or into Unity, excuse me. So next, I want to make sure that I'm only exporting what I want from this scene. I don't want to export this backdrop or these lights or this camera. If you were to export lights and camera from Blender into Unity, it wouldn't actually create lights. It would create floating points that you could attach lights to. You'd still have to create the lights in engine. But we don't want to include those lights. We want to do that after the fact in Unity. So instead, I'm just going to select this can model, make sure it's the last thing I selected. I can even hit A twice, so double tap A, and then select the can, and then just scroll through your hierarchy and make sure that you don't have any other objects selected. Then make sure you check off selected objects, and this will only export the can. So now I'm opening Unity because we need to check some things in Unity to make sure that we're exporting things correctly. If I'm in Blender, the next thing that I'm going to have to deal with is the transform, which is the forward and up. So if we go to Unity, I've just made a default scene and added a cube, and this cube is going to be our reference for what is up and what is forward. So forward is typically towards the camera in a default scene. So if we look at forward and move it towards the camera and then look at our position transform, we see that Z is negative. I've had some weird issues in the past where if I set Z to negative in Blender and then import this, it imports backwards. But then if I set positive Z to forward in Blender and import it, it still imports backwards. So I just set it to negative Z because I have given up trying to figure it out. Then if we drag up, we notice that Y is positive up. So we know that negative Z is forward and positive Y is up. So let's go back to Blender and forward is set to -z. If it's not, just click the drop down and then click is -z forward, and then y is set to up. So make sure that positive y is set to up. Finally, I have some animations in this. I did a turnaround for posting an animation online. But I don't want that in my final project. So I'm just going to uncheck this bake animation here. If you were doing something like animating a character and you wanted those animations in, then you should include bake animation, but I don't want my animations included, so I'm not going to. So just to reiterate, the main things that you want to focus on are you want to copy and embed textures. You want selected objects checked off. You want -z forward and y up, and this is specific to Unity. If you're doing Unreal, it's different. I'll go over that in a different video. And then I'm turning off bake animations because I don't want to include that. So finally, make sure that your file is named something that Unity will accept. So I have liquidcourage.fbx, and Unity will accept this. You can see I've already saved in FBX of this file, so if I were to hit export FBX, it would overwrite that file. But if I also wanted to make sure that I was overwriting it, I could just double click it, and it would do the same thing. So I'm just going to hit export FBX. Now I can open up Unity, and I can navigate to my file. So here's my FBX, and here's my texture that I used and imported into Blender. So I'm just going to drag my FBX from my file structure into my inspector. But what I did first was I went to the assets folder, and then I created a new folder and named it models. So that's up here, create new folder, name it models. And that'll just help you keep stuff organized and prevent unnecessary headaches. So again, to import this file into Unity, all we do is drag it from the inspector, or from the file explorer into the inspector. So you might notice it looks like this can is imported sideways, but if we drag it into our scene, it's all correct. So if I double click on this, it snaps to it. And you see it is backwards. I mentioned that earlier, how it's going to import incorrectly. So I'm just going to set the rotation to 180 on the y-axis, and now it's imported correctly. This probably won't matter too much, as you'll be placing this static mesh around the scene and rotating it to fit whatever you want in the scene, but it's good to know. I'm just going to set the position to 0, 0, 0. And next, what I want to do is make sure that those textures are applied correctly. As you can see, it already has a little bit of that metal texture that I created earlier. It looks a bit weird because my directional light is not white. It's a little bit of an off yellow. But if I change it to white, then it looks a little more correct. Next, I want to get my texture that I made in Photoshop into this file. So I'm going to take this texture and same thing, just drag and drop it in, and it automatically applies because we did that embed textures option in Blender when we exported the FBX. So everything looks pretty good to me. That looks correct. And now we're going to just move our reference cube back to the same position. And you might notice that this soda can seems pretty big. This reference cube is 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter. That's a standard unit in Unity. And most soda cans are a little smaller than that. So if we go to our scale, we'll notice it's set to 100 by 100 by 100. So if we just set this to 1, 1, 1, now it's properly scaled. So that's how you import your model into Unity. Make sure it's scaled correctly, make sure it's rotated correctly, and keep all of that important information about your textures and everything in the file. So now let's say you wanted to iterate on your file and change it up a bit. Maybe you've imported a temp asset and you want to replace it. So all you have to do for that is, you would think it's just go to your file, find the new version and drag it into the inspector. But when you do that, you see it creates a new file and then increments the name. And that can be a little bit frustrating because you don't want to have to go in and rename everything, delete the old file, and then have to replace this file in the scene. So instead, we'll just delete that. It's a little weird the way that Unity does this. Instead, you have to go to the actual Unity project files in your file explorer. And from there, you go to assets, and then the folder that you saved your file into. So I saved it in models. And then you make sure that these two have the same name. Copy this file, paste it into here, replace file in this destination, and then it will update your file. And the fun thing about this is it saves the position information, the rotation information, the scale information. Everything is saved and you don't have to go and drag it back into the scene, scale it down again, rotate it around, mess with the position, get it to where it was before. It just saves all that information and overwrites the old file with the new file. And that works for models, images. I believe it can even work for scripts, but I haven't tried that out yet. But that's how you import and then re-import files into Unity from Blender or any other 3D program that you can export a model from.